Can you hear me? There? Okay, great. Good morning. It's really great to see you all here. It's quite early in the morning, so I'm sure we'll fill up, but seeing as time's moving on and we've got a really great panel, I think we should be getting started. My name is Dixie Horton, and I work for Global Partners and Associates in London, and I'm going to be moderating the session today, together with Carlos Afonso from the Getulio Vargas Foundation in Brazil. And we have an extremely distinguished panel today. I'm going to start on the left and move to the right. First, we have Teresa Swinehart, who is the Director of Global Internet Policy at Verizon. Next, there's Philip Verveer, who is the US Coordinator for International Communications and Informations Policy. Next, there is Benedicto Fonseca Filho, who is the Ambassador of the Scientific and Technological Department of Brazil. Next is Jeremy Malcolm, Consumer International's Project Coordinator for Intellectual Property and Communications. Next, we have Bertrand de la Chapelle, who is Program Director at the International Diplomatic Academy. And finally, we have Henriette Esterhuizen, who is the Executive Director of the Association for Progressive Communications. And what we're really here today to talk about is the concept and the practice of multi-stakeholder governance of the internet, why we have it, where it's going, what are the threats, and how, whether we should be trying to support it, and if we are, what does that actually mean? So I'm just going to start with a little bit of a background. The internet, as we all know, developed in a very multi-stakeholder environment, and groups of engineers managed the functionality of the internet. So they were managing the maintenance of domain names, root servers, engineering protocols, etc. And these functional elements of the internet are still governed in that multi-stakeholder way by international bodies such as ICANN and the IETF. It's generally well accepted that governance has worked very well on a functional level. It has multi-stakeholder governance. It has provided the flexibility and functionality that we need to see really rapid growth. In fact, the internet has grown 3 or 4 times faster than traditional communications mediums, such as the radio or television, which grew up in a top-down regulated environment. During the WSIS process, this model was adopted as the appropriate model for internet governance more widely. So we have a definition now of internet governance, which includes governments, the private sector, and civil society, all with a place at the table in their respective roles. However, in more recent times, governments in particular have begun to challenge the notion of multi-stakeholder governance. Not all governments, it has to be said, but not so much in the technical field, but more in the policy field. We're seeing more and more very big policy questions coming up in the internet environment around intellectual property, around cybercrime, etc. And there's much less certainty and much more ambiguity about how we can address and solve these kind of questions in a multi-stakeholder fashion. And because of that, we're seeing more and more threats rise, more and more calls to bring internet policy questions to different forums, perhaps to create new forums. And so actually this question of multi-stakeholder governance is very central to where the whole internet governance sphere goes and the internet environment that we create. If we're going to face these challenges and threats, we really need to have a really robust understanding of what it is we're trying to protect and why and how we can move that forward. So that's kind of the goal, big goal of this workshop today, is to kind of develop that thinking and develop kind of shared understanding about the way forward. And I'm going to just hand over to my co-chair, Carlos, who I think has a few opening remarks.
Thanks, Dixie. And I would like just to make a quick addition, just to point out that when we discuss multi-stakeholderism, as we are proposing to discuss in this panel, we are of course addressing issues of participation, which is an issue that is quite crucial to some of the stakeholders, especially civil society and especially developing countries. So one of the ideas that we would like to have our panelists discussing, and we would like to bring up to attention of the audience, is the idea that the maintenance of an open and transparent process that end up like encouraging participation from a diverse range of actors. It's something that is paramount for democratic governance, and as being proposed by the Tunis Agenda of Information Society. But however, it's important to highlight that openness and transparency must come together with means to effectively include those interests in engaging and in discussing and doing policy making, especially when we discuss those that are from the developing countries. So the challenge of bringing the gap that separates those who are like well informed and have the resources to participate in internet governance fora on one side, and on the other side, those who have neither the resources nor the awareness, even though they could have the expertise in some related areas, for example, activism. It's something that can only be met if we have coordinator efforts that are conducted to this end. So I think that's just a couple of initial remarks, and I'll hand over to Dixie to begin our first part of our workshop. So,
Thank you, Carlos. So without further ado, let's get cracking. What we're going to do is we're going to spend about half an hour thinking about the actual concept of multi-stakeholderism, and we're going to have 3 panelists. Then we're going to have brief time for questions and responses from the panelists, and then we're going to move on to look at how it's actually working in practice in a number of different forums. So I'd like to start by going to Bertrand. Bertrand has recently wrote a paper for the Collaboratory, arguing that multi-stakeholder governance is necessary because the problems that we're facing now in the internet environment are post-Westphalian in character. This is a really interesting notion, so I wondered if Bertrand would like to start us off by expanding on this notion a little.
Thank you, Dixie. For those of you who are familiar with the expression Westphalian system, it relates to the period in the 17th century where, after 30 years of wars triggered by the previous big information invention that was the printing press, the principle of national sovereignty began to emerge. And this is the principle that is based fundamentally and has worked for a long period of time and is still working for many issues on the geographic boundaries of territories. And you know that the principle is a principle of separation of territories and a separation of sovereignties that basically define who has jurisdiction on the territory, the people who are there, and the activities they conduct. And the fundamental principle that underpins and legitimately underpins the international system today is the notion of sovereign equality of states, responsibility of the sovereign state on its territories and its activity, and non-interference in the affairs of others. This is a perfectly valid foundation, and there is no international activity that can be conducted in terms of regulation or policy making without taking into account the principle of sovereignty. I want to be very clear here that nothing that I'm saying is to imply that sovereignty is not still a founding or the founding principle of international norms. However, the problem that the internet produces is that we are witnessing today on a common space or common spaces a strong overlap of jurisdictional competences. And if you are a platform that wants to work globally to provide services to users, you're confronted with a very delicate problem, which is to be in compliance with 190 laws, and in many cases, not only national laws, but also sub-national laws. I'll give you an example. the province of Alberta in Canada has determined that the mode of operation of the Groupon coupons was not in conformity with the province of Alberta law for vouchers. Perfect exercise of sovereignty subsidiarity, very difficult to handle. The second problem that you are confronted with is that in certain cases, if you're a sovereign country, your own citizens may well become submitted to the jurisdiction of another one. I'll give you an example. In Norway, a citizen of Norway that had a discussion, not to say conflict with Facebook, went to the Data Privacy Commissioner in Norway. And the Data Privacy Commissioner in Norway said to a Norwegian citizen, "We are not competent. You should go to the Data Privacy Commissioner of Ireland because Facebook is serving Europe from Ireland." I can continue in many aspects. The challenge that we're facing today is that the boundaries of sovereignty in the digital space or in cyberspace do not map the physical territories. In the Mind paper that you kindly quoted last year, I used the term fractalization of sovereignty to describe the notion that the sovereignty of one country can extend on other countries. And I can give you also the example of the location of a certain number of operators on the territory of one country. And particularly, as you know, I'm on the ICANN board, I will take an example in the domain name space. If registry managing a domain space is located in one country, it makes sense that it is under the jurisdiction of that government. The fact is that those registries are often open to registration from people and actors in very different countries. And you're all probably aware of the challenges that came around decisions like Bodog and Rora Directa, where the fact that an actor outside of the United States was actually registering a domain through a registrar in the United States or in a registry in the United States led to a decision by the American authorities, which are valid under the notion of sovereignty, but impacted actors in another country. And without getting into too much detail, the challenge is that the exercise of sovereignty, the legitimate exercise of sovereignty on a national territory by a state can have extraterritorial, transboundary impact on another country. And furthermore, because the criteria for the determination of jurisdictional competence usually entail geographical criteria, either the location of the user, or the location of the operator, or the location of the server, or the location of the incorporation of the company, or the domain name, you can have a sort of overlap and piling up of jurisdictional competences that can even be contradictory. I give you a very concrete example again. If you're talking about defamation, within the same month at the beginning of this year, the Supreme Court in Canada determined that on defamation cases, if the content is visible in Canada, then the courts in Canada are competent to address defamation case. The very same month or a couple of weeks later, the Supreme Court in Ireland decided completely in the opposite direction that they were not competent because the case that was brought in front of them was about a website that was based in England for a newspaper in England. The challenge is that, to make a long story short, governments have problems enforcing their own rights on operators that sometimes are based in other countries. Other governments can have the capacity to enforce their own legislation on operator extraterritorially. The users are in a situation where there is a huge legal uncertainty, and the companies are confronted with the tension between trying to be as uniform in their rules and the internal rules as possible, and having to cope with 190 national laws. And so, in summary, because we can come back to all that later, the foundation of the question you asked is that we have based international normative orders on a principle of separation of jurisdictions and territories. And the internet is bringing a new challenge, is that in many cases we are talking about shared spaces. And those shared spaces are a sort of fuzzy zone that requires cooperation between the governments at least, but in many cases, and we'll come to that later, also the other actors. Because big platforms are providing a form of normative order as well through their terms of service that define the rules that apply in their own digital space or digital territories. Civil society actors are monitoring a certain number of practices that may not be in compliance with international law. And so the foundation for the multi-stakeholder approach is the need to cooperate to define norms of shared spaces and not to rely on the pure system of separation of jurisdiction that solves a lot of issues, but not all of them. And the internet is making making what was exceptions in the past almost the norm, i.e. interactions between people who are across borders. The final element is, we talk about internet governance and the multi-stakeholder model. I always try to push the distinction between governance of the internet and governance on the internet. Governance of the internet deals with the infrastructure, the logical layer, and this is where the multi-stakeholder organizations, IETF, W3C, the IRRs, ICANN, and others, have been working, and this system is a distributed governance system that works pretty well. It needs to be improved all the time, but it works, generally speaking. The challenge we have is we do not have yet, apart from the IGF, which is the embryo of those new tools, the appropriate multi-stakeholder tools to deal with governance on the internet, i.e. to deal with freedom of expression, privacy, fighting cybercrime, and all those things. So I want to introduce at the beginning this dual notion. One, we need to move beyond the separation of sovereignties to the co-management of shared spaces. And second, making a distinction between the governance of the internet and the governance on the internet, for which we need to invent new modes of enhanced cooperations. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. An interesting start. I sense a lot of head movement coming from Henriette, so we're going to come to her now to get her response.
I think I was reflecting because a year ago Bertrand wrote an article for a journal, Mind, and I was one of the respondents, and I was kind of suddenly taken back into that. And I certainly agree with Bertrand that the internet is demanding new ways of thinking about its governance, and that is indeed very challenging. I think the model that I feel is evolving, and one that I really would like political scientists and economists, if there are any in the room, to explore, is the internet emerging as a form of a global public good. Now, it's very complex because unlike water or clean air or other global public goods, the internet is not publicly owned or created. It's an ecosystem which is made up of many components, infrastructure, services, contents, and applications. Some of these are located in the public sector. Some of these are located in the private sector. And then the users of the internet populate it with content and also shape it and create it. But I think what we cannot deny is that it has emerged as a public space, public sphere, a public utility. And I think its governance requires increasingly, the development of common norms and understanding and principle, and also of negotiations in the same way that with water management. You also have different nation states. Rivers flow through many countries. When a dam, there's currently the news about the big dam being built in Laos. That's very controversial. There are environmental implications, and different governments are involved. That has to be negotiated. Water is also in many cases managed by private sector entities, sometimes by municipal entities. So it is very complex. I think the reason why I like the idea of finding ways of governing the internet based on the principle of it being a public good-like entity is because I think that is, from my perspective, the most reliable way to ensure that it is governed in the broadest possible public interest. But I definitely acknowledge that this is not a simple process. So, and as far as the jurisdiction of nation states and other jurisdictional questions, I think these are complex, but I think they're not just complex with regard to the internet. They're more complex with the internet. But I also think they won't go away. And I think one of the questions that I often reflect on and ask people about is in fact the one that you've raised about large internet companies that exist in a kind of extraterritorial reality. And I think they have become extremely important, but they are still just companies. And even if they are very important and very valuable companies that enhance our use of the internet enormously. And I think we have to find a way to address that at the level of competition, at the level of accountability, protecting consumer rights and human rights. But I also think we need to be wary about redesigning our governance and regulatory structures to entirely articulate just to this reality. And I think that is because of accountability, and I think nation states are not always reliable. They're not always doing as good a job as they should in protecting citizens' interests and rights, but they still have that accountability, and there is a form of recourse there for citizens. So that recourse is sometimes positive because you would trust your state and its instruments to take care of your interests. Sometimes it's not positive, and you would challenge your state to improve its capacity. Sometimes that challenge is constructive, sometimes it takes the form of protest. So I do think that is still important, and I think in the course of the internet we see that happening. And I also think what we do see is the existing global governance system beginning to respond to the challenge of the internet. And I'll end on the example, and maybe we can reflect on that, of the Human Rights Council resolution earlier this year, where there was unanimous agreement among Human Rights Council member states that human rights apply on the internet as much as they do off the internet. And I think just the other point I made in my paper as well, in response to Batra, the one was about the public space that is not necessarily publicly owned and controlled. The other is the ecosystem. I think that as the internet becomes more ubiquitous, defining it as an online space will actually become less and less done because it's so integrated. And again, therefore, I think approaching the governance of the internet separately from how you approach governance more broadly seems to me quite a short-term solution. I heard somebody from Internet New Zealand made the comment. She says at this point in governance we are still talking about offline versus offline, and her assessment was, or analysis, that was a generational thing, because we, the people in this room, have lived in a pre-internet world and we are now in the internet world, but a generation ahead we won't be determining how the internet is viewed, and that distinction between offline and online might not exist anymore in how governance and regulation approaches it.
Thank you, Henriette. I would like just to continue in this first part of the workshop in which we're trying to conceptualize multi-stakeholderism and its characteristics and its benefits to internet governance, to ask a third question to Ambassador Benedito Fonseca Filho. So my question will be still in a more general level, in a more conceptual level, but just beginning to introduce some experiences, because we can try to understand how, in some instance, sometimes the speed in which transformations are set in international level can be surpassed by the experience that you have in the national level. And Brazil, for more than 10 years now, has been very active in a multi-stakeholder, I would say, approach to internet governance with the Brazilian Internet Committee. But I would like to ask our ambassador, what are the benefits and the advantages of having this kind of multi-stakeholder approach to internet governance? We have more than 10 years now, so looking back to this decade of multi-stakeholder internet governance in Brazil, what were the benefits and what we can look forward in the future to advance this model, if it's fit to advance this model as it is today? So that will be the question. Ambassador, please.
Thank you. I thank the organizers for the invitation and the opportunity to speak. Closer. Okay. Thank you. Well, I think the first thing I'd like to say in regard to this issue is that as we speak of internet governance, be it at the national level or at the international level, from our perspective, we are talking about a new paradigm for cooperation, for organization of stakeholders. From the perspective of government, internet governance, and I refer to our experience, entails a somewhat new experience. Of course, in the context of government, there are some initiatives that seek to provide for more participation from society in the form of councils, of fora that provide advice to government in which issues are discussed, particularly social issues that have social impact, economic impact. There are some very interesting experiences through which society is consulted and has an impact on the government decisions. But in regard to internet governance, we go beyond that. The experience of the Brazilian Steering Committee is well beyond those experiences in the substance, in the way it deals with the issues. Roughly speaking, the Brazilian Internet Steering Committee is composed of 21 members, 9 from government in the minority, and 12 from different sectors, roughly divided between civil society, private sector, and academy. So this is as regard to the composition, and the Brazilian Steering Committee, among other things, recommends operational standards and technical procedures related to internet, establishes proposed strategic guidelines related to the use and development of internet, and coordinates .br. So those are, among other tasks, the ones that are performed by the Brazilian Steering Committee, in which government, as I have said, is in minority in regard to the membership. Decisions are usually taken by consensus, which is, I think, the appropriate way to go about those issues, but nonetheless it provides for a very robust form of multi-stakeholderism. I always say that Brazil, we are guided by 2 principles in regard to internet, both internally and externally. The first one is the multi-stakeholderism. I think it is something that is in our DNA in regard to internet governance. I'd say multi-stakeholderism is a key aspect of our approach. And the second one is our condition as a developing country that shares some of the concerns and some of the contexts developing countries are faced, but we also have we are very sensitive to some development issues, and those two aspects, the multi-stakeholderism and the developmental aspect, are the ones that I would say are the guiding principles, both internally and externally. What are the advantages of having such a multi-stakeholder model? I think the obvious advantage is that it provides legitimacy to government's decisions. It allows for decisions and for actions that are related to internet to be anchored in a fair balance of interests. Of course, we are talking of a system that is not perfect. I would not try to say that there are no differences among members that have to be somewhat addressed. There are no challenges to some decisions that are made. Of course, this is, I think, part of reality. But nonetheless, all stakeholders involved, they recognize the value of having such a structure in place. And from the point of view of government, it provides for a very good level of certainty, assurance, and legitimacy. And this translates itself, of course, internationally. When we come to a forum like this, we are very comfortable because we are in an environment that we also nurture in Brazil, this kind of discussion. If we think about it, if I can just say a word about what we think internationally, we would like, as government, speaking as government, also to see those principles governing internet internationally, that we should devise some way through which multi-stakeholder participation should also be encouraged. Of course, we are, again, talking about a new paradigm. Internally, we have decided this new paradigm that is the Brazilian Steering Committee. Internationally, we know, of course, it's much more difficult to have such a body in regard to representation, accountability. There are so many aspects to be dealt with. Nonetheless, we think IGF itself is a very interesting experience if we look across international organizations, existing internet processes. But IGF is a very interesting body, a very interesting animal, because it has somewhat emerged from a UN process, and it is not a UN traditional process. So I think it gives us hope that we can work around with partners and countries and stakeholders to try to devise a platform that will allow for enhanced cooperation, take into account the need to feed with the inputs from stakeholders. So this is the approach we are taking in regard to international discussions. We value very much the role that is played by IGF in fostering this debate. However, we think we still lack a platform for that, according to the Agenda Tunis, will enable governments to discuss public issues on a comprehensive way with full engagement or to the extent we can devise participation. So this is basically what I'd like to say for initial comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And before bring it back to the panelists to see if they want to react to the first talks that we had in this session, I would like to give it back to the audience. If anyone wants to ask a question, make a comment to our panelists, please just indicate it. I'm getting the mic to you. Okay, so please just identify yourself and to whom are you directing your question.
Hi, Igor Ostrowski from Poland, from Salens. Can you hear me? Yeah. I'd like to ask two very quick questions. First of all, alternatives. We understand that IGF is a very good sort of example, but there's also other organizations that who would like to see themselves active in the Internet Governance Forum or role. And for example, as we all know, the WICET is coming, the conference in Dubai in December, where the whole discussion will take place on amendments of the ITR that may lead to an increase of ITU's role in the internet governance. And just late last night, Poland has made a decision. It shifted from its original decision and actually said a clear absolute no We will not participate in any discussions. We're not open to any negotiations regarding internet governance at the ITU forum. There are other countries that are not decided, and I wanted to find out what is your view about, let's say, other forms, other ideas or other concepts of internet governance, like the one at ITU, that could be helpful before the meeting in December. And the second question I had related to those, let's say, initiatives in countries, different types of multi-stakeholder initiatives in countries where the government is not interested. Does it make sense, in your opinion, to organize different types of IGFs where the government is not present? What if there are, let's say, NGOs, users, businesses ready to talk, but the government is not? What do you do in such instances? Thank you.
Thank you. Let me just get the other set of questions here, so then we can turn back to our panelists. So, Steve, by yourself.
Hi, it's Steve Del Bianco with NetChoice. And Bertrand, you particularly said something I wanted to dive into a little bit deeper. You talked about the model of multi-stakeholderism is typically trying to generate convergence around operational and legal regimes. Wherever it can, it's convergence, certainly in the physical layers. But at the same time, it coexists with a divergence or a diversity of legal regimes. And I want to understand that whether you're comfortable that we'll have a lot of diversity in regimes. Let me just give an example. I mean, somebody who's publishing a website or posting comments or blogs may prefer top-level domains or registries and registrars in countries that really respect privacy. A parent might prefer domains in a country that censors content, or a consumer might prefer websites based in a nation, in a registry that's hosted in a nation that really aggressively polices fraud or counterfeits. And like the example you gave with the US regime cracking down through immigrations and customs enforcement. So that diversity might be a good thing and a complement to the convergence of multi-stakeholderism. I wanted to get your reaction to that.
Thank you, Steve. Let's just return to our panelists, and just a quick remark. As one of our panelists, we're going to tackle the ITU aspects. So this aspect of the first question, we're going to, I would say, send it to the second half of our discussions right after we have our panelists reacting to the questions and reacting to the first three statements that were made. So I want to turn to our panelists to answer the two questions, and if I kindly ask you to take it very shortly. Okay, so please, Henriette, go ahead.
I'll respond quickly to both questions. I think firstly to the second question about differing regimes offering more choice. I think yes, and I think at this point in time that is still of an advantage, I think. And our fear as civil society is that if governments at this point in time, or even governments and non-governmental stakeholders had to come up with common regimes, we might risk ending up with consensus but less freedom than having choice where we have differing degrees. I think the question that the participant asked about, does it make sense to organize these forums if governments are not interested? You know, I've been reflecting on that in the last few days because I'm from Africa, I'm from South Africa, and my organization works mostly in developing countries, and our governments are not here. And I oscillate between thinking it makes this space less valuable to us because we're not able to engage with them and build relationships with them, which is what's the greatest strength of the IGF. At national level, sometimes we have in South Africa an IGF convened by government. It's not terribly multi-stakeholder, but it is. There's some goodwill. It's just not executed well. But I still think, even though the lack of interest from government impoverishes these forums, I think they are still valuable. And I think that when it comes to the internet, as other speakers have said, and as Benedito have said, in the internet, it's a matter of time, and I think that it's worthwhile for other non-governmental stakeholders to persist. The internet cannot be governed. Policy cannot be made without it being done in a multi-stakeholder manner. And I think if we persist, governments will realize that they do need to engage. So I think leadership in Brazil, we've seen leadership has come from government. In other countries, sometimes leadership can come from other stakeholders. So I think it's challenging, but I do think it's worth persisting.
Two quick remarks. The first thing is that the multi-stakeholder approach is a set of principles that I could list and that were in the Mind article last year. But it is a little bit like representative democracy. Representative democracy is one type of governance system, but it has many ways to be implemented. I sometimes joke that between England and France, the monarchy is not necessarily the one you think. And they are both representative democratic systems, but the balance between the different chambers, the role of a prime minister or president, the US system is a representative democratic system, France as well, and many other countries. It's the same in the multi-stakeholder approach. The principles of openness, transparency, equal footing, participation, and so on give the capacity to many types of implementations. And one country will implement it a little bit more tilted in one direction, a little bit more tilted in another direction. I give credit, for instance, to Brazil to have persevered, because initially were the hardliner of the multi-stakeholder model, I would say. We're looking at the CGI committee. They were saying, oh, there are elements where the government is designating some people. This is not really multi-stakeholder. As a matter of fact, it moved forward and it demonstrated its benefit. And it is now, I believe, one of the national implementations that works best. Other countries will do it differently. It's the same for international organizations. I strongly believe that the multi-stakeholder approach will progressively gain credit in all international organizations. If you take the ITU, UNESCO, and ICANN, I often said that the three of them are multi-stakeholder-ish organizations limping on one leg. UNESCO doesn't have enough business participants. ITU doesn't have enough civil society participation. And at the time, ICANN didn't have enough governmental presence, and it has improved in that regard. Multi-stakeholder governance, and particularly the expression in the Tunis Agenda that says each actor in their respective roles, can be explained the following way. In multi-stakeholder governance, the roles of the different stakeholders vary according to the issue, the venue where it is discussed, and the stage of the discussion. And it is not a single model, it is not one single implementation, it is a principle and it is a spirit. And actually the spirit is a spirit of not representation of people, but representation of all the viewpoints. And why is it important to have all the viewpoints? Because it brings better decisions. And the example that Ambassador Fonseca was giving, there's an element of legitimacy, which I think is wonderful, but governments in general need to understand and be convinced that it is in their self-interest to use those processes, to alleviate the transboundary impact of other sovereignties, but also to have a better quality and enforceability and implementability of their decisions. And finally, on Steve Del Bianco's question regarding diversity, I will make a quick analogy. The internet has allowed, through a protocol, TCP/IP, the interconnection of thousands and hundreds of thousands of heterogeneous networks into a single thing called the internet, made interoperable. The HTML HTTP protocol has enabled the interconnection and interoperability of thousands and millions of databases that are heterogeneous. We need a governance protocol that enables the interoperability of hundreds of governance frameworks, national, business, and others. But this is a longer story.
Thank you, Bertrand. So the conversation has already started to move to, oh, sorry, Benedicto. Okay, as Benedicto, and then we're going to move on to Philip, if you want to respond.
Thank you. I want to be very brief, just to comment on the question related to participation of governments. I think, as I have said before, my appraisal is that we are talking about a new paradigm that is being forged, a new culture that is being nurtured, and it might take some time for people. Different countries are in different stages of considering this issue. But this is not detached from what is going on, for example, at the UN and other institutions, as Bertrand has said, in which we see increasingly the need perceived by these organizations in their self-interest as well to open up to society, to open up to new views. So I think this is a trend, and I think internet governance is maybe the one area in which this process will take the step ahead and will be in advance in regard to others, and this is in this spirit that we participate. In regard to Brazil's, I thank Henriette for saying that in Brazil government has taken leadership, but I would like just to maybe to be more, to acknowledge more the role of other sectors. I think, of course, the government has laid down some regulation that established the Brazilian Steering Committee that allows it to function and recognize the role of this multi-stakeholder participation. But this was done in recognition of the robust role that has been played by the private sector, by civil society, by the academy, in anticipation of the government initiatives. So I think this shows that from the start it was a collaborative effort. The government tries to work together with those other stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you, and I think we're seeing one of the difficulties, which is lots of opinions about multi-stakeholder governance and less time. But we've already seen the conversation move towards practical things, so I'd like to move to Philip Verveer now to talk about his experience at the ITU.
Thank you very much, and I will try to be brief in the interest of preserving time. There are 2 or 3 practical things that we can quickly point to that bear upon the subject of this morning's discussion. One, as already mentioned, is the World Conference on International Telecommunications. The view of the United States has been that this is not really a congenial or appropriate forum for the discussion of internet governance issues in any very direct way, something that the Secretary General of the ITU I think has also been very quick to say. There are a great many reasons that underlie that, and if we have time I'd be very glad to go into that. A second very interesting set of possibilities resonating rather strongly with what we've just heard, and I think especially with Ambassador Benedicto's comments, is very soon the United Nations will have an opportunity to consider extending or creating a working group on enhanced cooperation through the auspices or with the good offices of the Commission on Science and Technology for Development, which, as many of you will know, is unusual in the UN structure as being multi-stakeholder in nature. This is an effort that the United States strongly supports. It is one that our friends from India have been very active in. And the immediate antecedents of this involved a meeting in Geneva in May, where, again, I'm glad to say, although the meeting ultimately wasn't successful in reaching a consensus, it was one in which our friends from Brazil were extraordinarily active in terms of trying to achieve a consensus in order to permit CSTD activities involving a multi-stakeholder approach to enhanced cooperation. One other very important set of practical activities emerging very soon will be the WSIS +10 reviews that will be undertaken immediately next year by UNESCO and in 2014 by ITU. And again, there are some very important questions about whether or not these will be the principal places where the WSIS plus 10 review will occur, or there will be opportunities to expand this out in many ways to include other institutional actors, principally under UN auspices, but other institutional actors as well, looking at the very important question of whether or not the WSIS action lines in particular have been achieved, the extent to which they've been achieved. Many, many more things could be said about our subject matter today, but I think in the interest of time, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Philip. I would like to hand the floor to Teresa now, and Teresa has any comments on the statement that Philip has mentioned. And as Teresa has been involved in ICANN as well, if you want to jump in and maybe do some approach on the ICANN take on multi-stakeholderism, I think that could be something that could help us to get the conversation going. So Teresa, the floor is yours.
Sure, I'd be happy to. First, thank you very much for the opportunity to participate here. I think this dialogue highlights not just the complexity of the issue, which has evolved in part with how the decentralized nature of the internet has evolved, but also the evolutionary factor of it. If one looks back to 2005, when the Tunis Agenda was adopted, to where we are today, I don't think we could have fathomed to be having dialogues like this. Nor do I think we could have fathomed having such active engagement in some of the discussions that Ambassador Vivier just highlighted. I think we would have had a different approach to the dialogues because of less awareness of the importance of discussions in forums that have an impact on the broader nature of the internet. So if I think we take a look at the models and how they've evolved over time, and the discussions that will be occurring next year in the WSIS plus 10 and the discussions at the end of this year, we also need to be looking at how do we work with our multi-stakeholder organizations and improve them. How do we, in practical reality, improve the operationalization, if I can put it that way, and ability to engage, to lend comfort to the evolution, to create paradigms and platforms to discuss various issues that are of importance, and to evolve organizations and institutions to make them more, places where people want to have dialogues. And I think next year in the WSIS plus 10 we'll also see this evolve. I think one of the things that we're noticing and is how to have organizational structures that are living organizational structures. And here I'll touch on the experience, not just with the ICANN model, but actually with the IGF itself. You need to have mechanisms that allow changes to occur. When ICANN was first formed, its structure that was put into place was bringing together very divergent views and cultures and approaches to work. I'm sure everybody's heard the stories of the engineers and business and everybody, and how do you come together. You need to have the opportunity to identify and incorporate new stakeholders into the processes and new views. You need to ensure that the opportunities for stakeholders who've never had the opportunity to participate can engage in that. So as we look at this IGF, and the first one we ever had, we see that we need to continue to work on improving these. As we look at the WSIS plus 10 process, we need to look at how we're looking at policy decisions, how we're looking at the ability for stakeholders to engage, and where we might have gaps in those areas for the future. So I think we have a lot of work on the the practicalities of it.
We do, and thank you for highlighting all those issues that we do need to address. Jeremy, I know that you've been doing some work to try and address them, and I would like to hear your opinion.
Thanks very much, Dixie. And this workshop is about threats to the multi-stakeholder model, and so perhaps there hasn't been so much about the threats, and I'd like to deal with that. So one of the problems that I see is that all of the stakeholders, certainly in this room and the other participants in the IGF, are all very strongly supportive of multi-stakeholderism in theory, but often it seems to be just lip service that's being paid to the multi-stakeholder model, and actually in practice steps are not taken to consult with all stakeholders before new rules are being formed. So at the intergovernmental level we have processes like ACTA and the Trans-Pacific Partnership. At the national level we have laws like SOPA, PIPA, the Indian Intermediary Guidelines, new laws in the Philippines on cybercrime, in Malaysia, amendments to the Evidence Act there. And these are all going through without any attempt at a multi-stakeholder engagement. It's not just governments, it's corporations too that are acting without multi-stakeholder engagement process. So Google's response to the Innocence of Muslims video, it may well have been the correct response, but it wasn't really informed by a multi-stakeholder process. The extrajudicial banking blockade of WikiLeaks, again, was something that was really taken by certain companies without reference to the broader stakeholder community. There are also some good things that are being done by governments and corporations alike, but they are not being done following this multi-stakeholder process, and so therefore they're rather detached. They're a patchwork. There's no overall framework for accountability and assessment of these actions. We're seeing that there is a degree of forum shopping going on. For example, the OECD's internet principles have gone straight from the OECD to APEC, which is another intergovernmental body and even less multi-stakeholder, or less multi-stakeholder I should say, than the OECD itself, rather than coming to the IGF to be discussed first of all. So I think there needs to be more effort at actually putting into practice multi-stakeholder engagement at the global level. It doesn't just have to be at the global level. Steve Del Bianco mentioned that in some areas there will always be diversity, and that can be a good thing. Privacy is one area in which that's particularly the case, but there are other areas like defamation of religion, which we're never going to agree on principles at the global level. But as Bertrand said, because internet governance decisions usually have cross-border effects, in general that points towards the need for global level principles to guide regulation at the national level and to guide corporate behaviour. So there needs to be some work towards global consensus principles. In some areas we already have global consensus principles, so the Universal Declaration of Human Rights itself is such. We have principles in certain specific areas like internet names and numbers, which have been globally developed through multi-stakeholder processes. But there are always gaps. There are always going to be some areas in which there is no body, there is no Human Rights Council, there is no ICANN, there is no body that has overall responsibility for global development of policy principles, so areas like cloud computing, privacy, cybercrime. So we still need to have some way of developing global guidance for policymakers in a multi-stakeholder way for areas where there is no existing body to do so. So there are really three options for how we can do this. We could have, firstly, a new body to be the enhanced cooperation body, which doesn't exist at present. The problem with that is that, firstly, if such a body is to be UN-linked, it's going to be resisted very, very strongly by most of the internet community, and so in practical terms that won't happen. We'll get fears of a UN takeover of the internet, as we've seen. For example, with the Committee on Internet-Related Policies that was proposed, very strong pushback against that. So I don't see a new body as an option, certainly not a new UN-linked body. The second option is that we could get an existing institution to take over filling these gaps, such as the ITU, but of course nobody probably in this room wants to see that because of the deficits that exist in the ITU's processes. And I see the third option as bringing the enhanced cooperation process back to the IGF, whereby it can make recommendations on emerging issues. In fact, the IGF's mandate from the start did include the ability to make recommendations on emerging issues where there are gaps, where there are no other institutions that are already dealing with these issues. The problems, though, the IGF is lacking leadership at the moment. The multi-stakeholder advisory group has come to a point where it really can't make decisions unless there's full consensus. And there are certain forces on the MAG that have been there since the beginning. There are certain stakeholder representatives who have never rotated off the MAG and who have been rather strongly resisting any sort of evolution of the IGF's processes. The CSGD in some ways is even worse in that it's also a body that requires and explicitly requires full consensus before it can do anything. And an overriding problem for the IGF is the lack of money. There's no funding, and perhaps that is because those who might contribute funding to the IGF feel it to be a threat to their own existing power base over internet governance. So the solutions, I don't really have time to spend much in going into those solutions, but I think for one thing the MAG really needs to be shaken up. The IGF will die eventually if it offers no tangible benefit for stakeholders to utilise it. I think the old blood needs to make room for some new ideas within the MAG. I think we need to begin by accepting that there has been no other way to operationalise enhanced cooperation. There is no other practical option for the development of globally applicable public policy principles other than for that to happen within the IGF. There's not going to be a new institution. We're not going to take it to any other institution. If it's going to happen at all, it has to happen within the IGF. And if it doesn't happen, then there's going to be ongoing calls by developing countries, and this issue is not just going to quietly disappear. Some changes do have to be made. So I think once the political will to make those evolutions in the IGF is there, the rest of it is quite easy. Actually creating a multi-stakeholder working group within the IGF on the model of the working group on internet governance is not going to be hard. We've done that before. There are processes by which deliberation can be facilitated towards agreement on difficult areas. Deliberative democracy is well studied in theory and has been put into practice, and there are ways of actually coming to agreement in difficult areas amongst stakeholders who have divergent interests. The MAG in the past has considered various non-traditional approaches, such as speed dialogues, roundtables and debates. So I would like to see these come back onto the table. And I was very interested to hear from Ambassador Verveer that the United States is now supporting the formation of a working group to talk about mechanisms for enhanced cooperation, because my understanding in the past had been that there hadn't been agreement to do that. So I think that's a very, very promising development, and I'm very glad to hear that. So I'll leave it there, but I'd be glad to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. And before we turn back to our panelists to reflect or comment the statements that we had, let me just return to the floor and see if anyone wants to ask a question or make a comment. Okay, so just wait a sec.
Thank you. Sound okay? I was particularly pleased to hear the remarks of Ambassador Filho, and I want to compliment the Brazilians on their work domestically in setting up the multi-stakeholder group to shape internet policy. I think it's a great model that many other countries could follow. A number of civil society organizations have been talking about internet governance in recent months, and in terms of the ITU, there's been a concern, I think, that the ITU does not extend its remit into those areas of internet governance that traditionally have been multi-stakeholder. So while we recognize the traditional role of the ITU in telecommunications, networks and interoperability, we're not keen on seeing that extend much broader, as some of the proposed revisions appear to suggest. And that's a view that's shared by the major Brazilian NGOs that you'll be familiar with, such as FGV, Nupervan, the Consumers Organization. Is that the view of the Brazilian government at this stage, or are you still considering your attitude to the revisions? It would be interesting to know.
Okay, I'm Paula Tiihonen from the Finnish Parliament, not a member of Parliament, but a civil servant working for the Committee for the Future, and first time here. I'm interested in the nature of the IGF and, of course, the future. Do you want to be an open forum in the future as a think tank, or do you want to be as some kind of institution, so grown up in the hierarchy of the institutions? Then you need a leadership, management, some bodies who are responsible for the resolutions, for the statement, but you can't be both of them, I suppose, because I have worked 25 years in the Finnish Parliament in a normal standing committees which make statements, laws. But I have also worked 20 years in the committee, which is Committee for the Future, which can't make laws or statement, but it can make recommendation, it can be a think tank inside the Finnish Parliament. And that's unique in the world. I know it's the only parliament in the world where it has a think tank inside the parliament. So that's the background for my questions. You have to decide which you want to be in the future.
Thank you. My name is Rinalia Abdurrahim. I am a member of the ICANN at Large Advisory Committee, and I'm from Malaysia. I would like to make a comment on the point that Jeremy made about Malaysia's amendments to the Evidence Act. I think that it is important to note the context. Malaysia actually had an exemplary multi-stakeholder consultation model that is nationwide on ICT matters that predates the World Summit on the Information Society. This started around 1996, 1997. What had happened was there was a change in leadership, and then there was a regression or a deficit in terms of multi-stakeholder consultation, willingness, political will, and ability. And this is a problem in some countries, and I think it was alluded to by a previous gentleman who raised the issue of what happens when government leadership is not willing to take on this multi-stakeholder model anymore. And what you said about accountability frameworks is very important, but when the government can just say, we do away with it now, that's a real problem. For Bertrand, the issue of representation of views versus representation of people, great idea, but I think when you want to have views represented, you then have to have people selected to represent those views, and I think there are challenges there as well. So how do you deal with that? Thank you.
Thank you. And just one last question after you return. So please go ahead.
This is also Nadine Sharif with the Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies, and this is my first time engaging with IGF. And one of my issues, which you saw in the opening session, is it seems most of these multi-stakeholder, most of the ones I've engaged with, seem to, no matter what, because of the structure, because of the balance of power, seem to be biased towards governmental representation. When an ambassador walks in the room, there's a protocol to him. He speaks at the podium. And so, how can you really guarantee equality in engagement when the minister of Egypt walks in and, let's say, I'm supposed to speak, he will obviously be giving deference over me. So, I mean, in this type of looking at UN protocol, looking at different protocols, and just to sort of repeat at the front, and I'm not saying we need to do away with this, but we need to find a balance in the system, is when you're entering, there's a special entrance for government officials, high government officials. That automatically sets up the paradigm that I am not an equal member in engaging in this forum.
Thank you. As we probably won't have much time for final remarks, can I ask our panelists to reflect upon the questions that have been made and make it as your final remarks as well, as we have like only 10 minutes. So starting from the left side, Henriette, please go ahead.
Thank you. I think sort of 3 points, which I think also responds to the question. I think we need to, I agree with everything Jeremy said, by the way, and I do agree the IGF therefore is such an important space. I think Teresa's point about needing mechanisms that allow for change to happen is very important. Yes, mag rotation, but it's more than that. It also has to do with the format of the IGF and also the format of other multi-stakeholder forums. And I think that responds to your question. You know, I'm from civil society, and for me the most exciting thing about the first IGF in Athens, 2006, was that we did not have color-coded name tags. When you met someone, you could not, you know, you had to ask them, where are you from? Now you look at the name tag and you know technical community, government, civil society, etc. So I think that is a challenge. I think the UN has to take on that challenge, because many of these formalities do not come from the IGF community as much as it does from the UN. And I think there are behavioral changes, and I think governments need to be willing to participate in a space in a different way. And I think many of them actually are, if they were given the opportunity. Secondly, I think what makes this process work, and maybe this also helps address Rinalia's question about representation and views. I think multi-stakeholder processes work best when the individual stakeholder groups or interest groups are relatively cohesive or have opportunity to at least engage amongst one another and thrash out their own differences or build understanding. And I think that's one of the difficulties that as civil society often find in this space, that we're very dispersed, we very rarely have the opportunity to get together. So I think homework, pre-work is also very, very important. And I think governments need also a space where they are able to engage with one another as governments, not in a hierarchical way, but in a way to prepare and have greater comfort for participation in the IGF. And then in response to the model, I think it's a think tank. I think it has to be more than just a forum where people come together. I think it's a perfect forum where we can identify challenges, areas that need further work, and then we can establish working groups. I think, as Jeremy has said, where these issues can be thrashed out, more research can be done, and recommendations can be made. And these could be sent to other policy-making institutions. So I think it's not a policy-making institution, but it needs to consolidate and use the crowd and this huge crowd wisdom that is in here to channel it more effectively into actual policy-making policy-making process.
Thank you. And a reminder to everyone to just be quick so we can get coffee.
Any governance process goes basically through 5 stages. There's an agenda setting and issue framing. Then there's the drafting of whatever proposal there is. Then there's a validation phase. Then there's implementation and enforcement. The forum is entirely in the first leg. It's an issue framing, agenda setting space. Whatever we want to do, we need to move also and enable the other functions. But that doesn't mean it will be the forum itself. It will emerge and be catalyzed by the forum. And if you look at the discussion that took place in the pre-event on enhanced cooperation, the notion that we should be talking about enhanced cooperations in the plural took some root. And another way to qualify this is that we need issue-based stakeholder networks to address operationally a certain number of questions. And the role of the forum is not to set up committees, working groups necessarily. It's to catalyze the formation of such issue-based stakeholder networks. The second thing, and by the way, when you ask, what do you want? You were asking the question almost as if we were representing the deciding body of the IGF. It's a little bit like the IETF. There's no there. There is no IGF staff, basically. The second quick thing is Jeremy spoke about general principles. And I want to share one that has emerged in the Council of Europe in the context of a recommendation adopted at the end of 2011 that is related to a principle of responsibility of states regarding preventing transboundary harm to the access and use of the internet, i.e. states, in the exercise of their sovereignty, have a responsibility not to impact other states. This principle was elaborated and suggested in the Council of Europe. Before we get into the implementation details, it needs to be tested and discussed in other places. And finally, a bit of advertisement. We have two workshops, one this afternoon at 4:30 and one tomorrow in the afternoon at 2 on the geography of cyberspace and frameworks for online platforms that will expand on what we discussed today.
Well, just briefly on the model question, certainly we don't want to make laws at the IGF. Of course, that's not on the table. But as Henriette said, it can be a think tank. And what we've already seen is the development of a plethora of statements of internet governance principles. One thing that the IGF could do is to bring these together and to find commonality and to see if we can't bash out some IGF-wide multi-stakeholder set of principles. So that's one thing that I would like to see the IGF doing over the next 18 to 24 months. Secondly, on the question about UN protocol, in theory, it is possible to design processes, and I've already spoken about deliberative democracy, which strip away all of the class and power imbalances that people have, and so they're talking at exactly the same level. Now, whilst that would be great, certainly governments are not going to be entirely comfortable with that. So we have to strike some balance, and I don't want to get too technical, but there is a form of organisation called the consociation, which means that the stakeholder groups do come together, but they also have their own private spaces where they can use their own preferred collaboration techniques to agree within themselves before they do come together in a wider forum. So I don't really have too much time to go into more of that, but I think that we need to strike that balance between something that the governments will be comfortable with, and we do want to attract governments, particularly from the global south, and the freedom to communicate as equals.
Thank you.
Thank you. There are so many aspects, but I'll try to be as brief as possible. In regard to the ITU meeting, we have not yet finalized a position, but as of today, what I could anticipate is that we do not have any intention to expand, to work towards the expansion of the role of ITU in regard to internet governance, also in line with our internal procedures in this regard, in which we make a separation between internet and telecommunications, so we don't consider them to be the same thing. So this is the approach we are taking, but again, the final position in the details is still being finalized. I would caution against making maybe reference to initiatives on the legislative, because we know these are different branches of government, and no one can prevent a legislator to propose some piece of legislation that would go even against its own government's approach. So in our case, what we would do in such a situation would be to work with Congress to try to convince and work towards something that would better be in accordance with our views. And by the way, to the extent that multi-stakeholderism will be strengthened, Congress will also receive input from the other actors, and Congress tries, of course, to resonate the views from society. So, but we cannot say that because some initiatives have appeared in such and such country, that reflects the country's approach to the issue. This is not correct. In regard to enhanced cooperation, we favor the establishment of a new platform. This is the expression we use, not a body, but a platform for discussion of those issues that would enable governments to discuss the public policy issues. We do not think, in principle, IGF would perform this role. We think those are different in nature, in structure. We would need something more focused on the needs from the point of view of government to receive some input that is also in a comprehensive way. What we are supporting, and I'm also very glad to hear the US supporting that, is the establishment of a working group to collect views on how we could go about it. We have, of course, our preference, but we are open to the discussion. We are not prejudging the results of the working group. Two very quick words in regard to threats. I think it's important we have not touched on this. I would say maybe two threats in regard to multi-stakeholderism. One is that it would be hijacked by one particular stakeholder, one sector. I think it entails the danger that other stakeholders will not be motivated to participate in the exercise, will not feel part of the decision-making of the process. I think this is maybe one of the great threats to multi-stakeholderism at both national and international levels. And one very last comment, from the minute I came here, I did not receive any differentiated treatment. I was late for the first day, for the first panel I was in, and I tried to convince but I was forced to go in line with like everybody else, and I think it's very good that it takes place like this. I had to get in line to get food, and even to speak in the workshops. Of course, I had to stand up and stay behind the microphone like everybody else. Of course, if we are thinking of the opening ceremony, there are some protocol aspects to be followed, but in general, I think this spirit, which I think is very good, I think reflects the kind of joint work we are trying to do together. Thank you.
I think, again, in the interests of time, let me say that it's clear that the IGF today is inevitably imperfect. There are many opportunities for improvement. The kinds I think we ought to be focusing on most strongly are those that would make this more attractive for everyone from the global south, not just governments, but everyone from the global south, to find this an attractive forum to attend and to find ways to enable those from the global south to attend. I do think if the IGF were to become decisional in any particular way, it would essentially destroy it as a forum. I think this is a risk that we ought to simply set aside, not undertake. Last point. I feel very strongly that the IGF will benefit tremendously if the United Nations will appoint the special advisor and find an executive secretary to assist with its work. It is very unfair to all concerned, the national host and to those who put these things together, to ask them to do this without the benefit of that kind of assistance.
I'll be very quick. This has been a very useful discussion. I think it's also highlighted that multi-stakeholderism is actually not easy. It's a challenge. It's a privilege, and it's a challenge, both for the governance of the internet and the governance on the internet, which was raised earlier. And I'm just going to highlight two areas. Operationalizing it takes resources, it takes transparency, openness, and accountability, and it takes mechanisms to ensure that. And those aspects in a multi-stakeholder model require work to do by everybody and to own that work. But also in the form of engagement, one needs to engage. It's a two-way street. It's a multiple-way street, if we can put it that way. We need to use the processes. It belongs to the stakeholders, and we've developed living mechanisms in organizations, and one needs to engage in moving new ideas forward. But because it's multi-stakeholder, and because there's engagement, one has to work with other stakeholders to try to reach the consensus for an idea, whether it's for or on the internet, anyone. And we've seen some ideas in this meeting, whether it's around mapping and assessment relevant to enhanced cooperation, or the dialogue on enhanced cooperation overall, dialogues around principles or other issues. We've seen a huge evolution and reaching agreement on areas where it shows that it's ripe to move forward to the next level. And I think that's the beauty of the model, but it takes a lot of work on many levels.
Thank you so much, and especially because that was a very good concluding remark as well. And I want to make a very, very big thank you to all our panelists, and a very, very big thank you to the audiences. And it's a very equal thank you to all of you as well.